I need to rectify, it's not really a presentation. I'm just sharing with you some thoughts that come from my personal experience and practice for having participated in translation and interpretation for some time when I was a young diplomat. The first thing that I'd like to share with you is that, of course, in a globalized world, if we can communicate directly in a common language, say Esperanto, a language which doesn't belong to anybody, but that is shared by everybody, that would be ideal. Nobody would object to sharing a language that belongs to nobody. But this is not the case, and today English has de facto become that kind of lingua franca or common language. So in our globalized world, it is much better when you can afford to communicate directly. But the 7 billion human beings on this planet, not that many of them know English after all, or a common international language. So as I said earlier, translation will always be necessary. It will also be always necessary because beyond just personal direct contacts, if you go into science and culture, translation will be needed. I would like to take the case of Japan. I visited Japan. I'm sorry, Mr. Yoshiki is not around anymore, and I stand to be contradicted by him, but in Japan, they are recognizing that perhaps in order to better integrate internationally, at least in the academic circles and in the institutions of higher learning, in the universities, practice of English should be better promoted and more widely promoted. But I sort of inquired, and what I discovered was one of the reasons why quite a number of Japanese academics who conduct quality research do not really master English, at least oral English that would help them better integrate into the world of international or global science, is that in Japan, scientific textbooks and research books are translated into Japanese very fast. It's a matter of weeks, a couple of months before, a new research publication in English or French or whatever is turned into Japanese. So they have that advantage, which then leads to a disadvantage, is that they don't feel the urge that Vietnamese researchers, they feel that imperative because we don't have that luxury. Most books get translated very slowly when they are not commercially profitable or viable. So in Japan, I do understand why in Japan translation is so important. I would also emphasize, because there was a mention in the presentation of the president of the AATI, I believe that human translation will always be necessary for highly cultured related content, and that culture, and this is my message today, is not just about language, because the title of this first theme is Language, Translation and Globalization, or International Integration. But I think that we should always keep in one concept, language and culture, not dissociate culture from language. You can speak English at a very fast speed, but if you don't know the culture of the society whose author comes from. How can you translate a novel back into Vietnamese if you don't know American society, you don't know Australian society, and you translate a book from, say, an Australian author, an American author? So culture is at the heart of it. And so my sort of message is, all of us who do translation, especially written, in-depth, quality translation, then let's invest in learning about culture, into going into the culture of the target language or the language, the source language. This is also, and then of course it was also underlined that translation requires technique and a special methodology that has to be learned, acquired and improved through learning and practice, conscious practice and methodical practice. And that is why in the early years after reunification, there were people who thought inviting an overseas Vietnamese would be very good because he or she would be able to help with translation, which is not the case. You can be a native speaker of English and not be able to translate into the foreign language that you know. So this is also something that needs to be emphasized. And earlier I remember saying that in the broader public there is still that misconception that, you know what, translation is not so difficult, you know. Why do translators and interpreters make such a fuss about it? And in my very early days in diplomacy, I remember being told that somebody from the personnel department commented that, you know what, a duck is a duck. A duck is convict. And that's it, you know, that's all it is about, you know, translation. Now, if that were all it was about, then Google Translate, then, you know, automatic or mechanical translation would be perfect. But what I'm saying is, language is so culturally, you know, embedded that there is no way that you can, you know, just rely on machines or computers. Same thing as with computer chess, you know, and human chess. Computers can compete, but perhaps at the end of the day, you know, human beings will still, you know, carry the day. The fourth point I'd like to share with you is people sometimes say practice makes perfect. That's about language training. But as students sometimes ask me, you know, would you have any advice about improving linguistic ability and your language competence? And my advice to them is, of course, you need to practice, but practice in itself, you know, what I would call automatic practice is very slow at getting results. And all the best achievers, I think, have to rely on what I call conscious, methodical, methodology-based practice. In other words, you have to be, you know, strongly aware as you practice, and you need to take time after you have practiced to think back. Where did I go wrong? What did I do wrong? And so it's worth always spending a number of minutes, if not of hours, sort of pondering about, you know, how we performed when we translated. Fifthly, a point that I think I hope it will not be wasted on all of us is Today, English is the national official language in many countries, and at the same time it is the lingua franca, or the common language, among many nations. So what you have out there is a very broad diversity of English practices. And what I'd like to emphasize is that we need to recognize, accept, and master, if necessary, those diverse types of English. I have heard that some Vietnamese parents say, I don't want to send my kid to Singapore because he or she will come back speaking Singlish. Frankly, I do not necessarily agree with that person. Now, first of all, that person does not realize that English, as I said, is becoming the lingua franca. When you say you learn English, it doesn't mean you are a profound admirer of either America or Australia or the UK. When you say, I need to study English, I need to practice English, I need to have my kid, be fluent in English, it's just an international communication tool. And in a sense, it needs to be approached as something international. Where the national aspect enters into the picture more is when you translate works of literature. Then yes, a novel will always, have a national imprint. But in the sort of more casual or daily communication, then the cultural aspect sometimes, at least in the pronunciation, is not that important. What is more important is to be understood. I don't think you should pride yourself, in saying, thinking, I speak British English or I speak American English. That's really, frankly, not important. You may believe you're speaking American English, but you're not understood. Or you speak a kind of English that's very inelegant, inaccurate, and so on and so forth. So the important thing is to be understood and the quality. If you happen to have a Singapore accent, so what? And mind you, the Indian accent that many of us find so hard, but after all, there are more than 1 billion practitioners of that kind of English. You can't just shrug your shoulders and say, I don't want that. I mean, you might have one day to do business with India, so I think you had better, get sort of accustomed to that kind of pronunciation or accent. At the end of the day, what I'm saying is, the international tool of communication, which is international or global English, the same concept as when I was studying in France. I was studying English in France, which is a bit funny, but the concept of transatlantic English was appearing, meaning it's no longer completely British English that was, the preeminent kind of English, nor was it completely the American, American English. So they developed a concept called transatlantic between those two continents of Europe, and more particularly UK and the US. So if they have developed that kind of approach, that we should not sort of equate English with any single country. And so I think all of us, all of you, should feel comfortable practicing the kind of English that you've been trained in, or that because of your daily work and work relations you're used to, is perfectly all right. And so there's no caste or class in that kind. The important thing is to be understood. And the final point I'd like to make is, so at the end of the day, each of us should try to develop practice of English that is our own. Of course, we need to take into account, global trends in the English practice. We cannot pretend not to see the new types of words that appear on the web that are becoming more popular among young people globally, and so on and so forth. At the same time, one of these days, Vietnam might come up with a particular English word. Why not? I'm sure that in Singapore they must have a couple. I haven't had time to look into that, but India definitely, and so on and so forth. Why do you have words that are more Australian than anything? Who knows? One of these days we're going to coin a couple of words, that will be used beyond the borders of Vietnam. English word, I mean. And for that, in other words, my last message is: we strive for quality, but let's not be purist, because being purist in this globalized world, I think, is being a bit conservative. Thank you.